Thank you, John, for being with us again. For those of you that missed the first time and maybe don't know John, John was former CEO of Cable and Wireless. He was in the telecommunications industry for about 30 years, serving in executive positions in Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Has also served as president of Cable and Wireless's consumer division and chairman of the Bahamas Telecommunications Company. We previously talked with John about kind of the future of telecommunications. Now we want to zero in on regulation and how the pandemic might be affecting regulation, kind of lessons that we're learning from that. So, John, let's just jump right into it.
Sure.
First off, what do you think are the lessons for regulation that are emerging from our times during this pandemic?
It's a good question. Well, I think first and foremost, I believe that regulators, if they hadn't before, and I believe in most cases they had, really now understand the critical nature of the telecom companies' role in infrastructure building, how critical their networks are, and how much they really depend on them. I'd also say, as an offshoot of that, although I've read some sort of different views as to the performance of the networks themselves, I believe overall they've held up pretty good, and they can trust the network operators to make the changes required to ensure continuity, and I guess really put aside some long-established commercial policies or procedures to ensure that connectivity and really lifeline services remain up. And I think that's perhaps the two most important takeaways for me. But also, I believe from a government or from a regulatory perspective, if it wasn't clear as to those network operators being more than communications and entertainment service providers, and how the network itself needs to evolve, be invested in, and grow to help the growth of the company as an economic vehicle, I believe that's now perhaps more relevant or more accepted than it was before.
All right, well, thank you. So when we talk about regulation, one of the things we've learned over the years in our economic studies and just practical lessons is that regulation has an impact on how operators make investments. So let's just start with, as a practical matter, your experience being executive in companies. How does regulation affect your investment decisions? What were those conversations like? What aspects of regulation mattered, if anything at all?
Well, I'll say first right up front that over 30 years, it's been rare that I felt, and the companies that I work for felt, that we were being impeded by a regulatory regime. It has happened, but it's not common, which is probably expected. Telcos, cable operators, telecommunications companies in general invest a lot of capital. We used to, in the early days, and this is going back, and it really hasn't changed a lot, although I think from a revenue perspective it has. There was an old joke in the industry that it's a cash cow but a capital pig. Well, it's not so much a cash cow anymore, but certainly it's still a capital pig. And I think that for a company deciding to invest a significant amount of capital, and for those companies, it makes it more complicated when you have assets in different countries. And so if you had an asset in a country, you have one regulator, you're abiding by those regulatory requirements, your business cases are not necessarily simple, but they're constrained or they're confined to a local geography. And you make business cases based on that, a simple sort of business process. When you're in multiple jurisdictions, it becomes increasingly complicated. One is that you're dealing with various regulators. They're not all consistent, certainly in the Caribbean and Latin American region that I work primarily in. In Canada, it was easier. It was the CRTC, and it was sort of a blanket coverage. But the decisions you make then are sort of taking into account first, what is the business plans? And again, for those on the line, as I indicated a couple of weeks ago, there is an internal jockeying of stakeholders to submit their own business plans based on a department or based on a country. And so there's competition internally. And it's not all what's the best return, what's the best IRR, what's the least amount of capital to achieve our objectives. It does take in consideration the environment in which that capital is being deployed, from a government perspective in terms of taxation, from a regulatory environment in terms of, are we going to be impeded in the deployment of capital? It's not so much what can we get, because I was racking my brains over the last couple of weeks as to trying to think if we ever received any kind of financial stimulus or incentives to invest. I don't believe we ever did. I'm not even quite sure we even had any tax breaks when we were launching new companies. But again, 30 years, my memory is probably not that great. But so it's not so much what we get, is how well can we deploy that capital? Are there any impediments? So from a regulatory perspective, it's really the environment that's created between all stakeholders. And then I would say is allowing the operator to deploy the capital effectively. But that's really the concern. But it does start from a normal business case process, deploying capital. Tough decisions had to be made internally, and then obviously taking in consideration the broader market in which that capital will be deployed.
So you talked about impediments. Give me some examples of things that you would have considered impediments, or you've seen other people consider impediments.
Well, I think we've gone through, I was, I guess, in a situation where the companies I worked for were always acquiring companies, whether in Canada, the Caribbean. I believe when we left Canada, even though we were a rural operator, we had done something like 50 acquisitions over 10 years. It was, small mom and pops, some that doubled our size, but still a small player compared to sort of the big players in the market. And in the Caribbean, we really started off by buying, 30% of Cable Bahamas as Columbus, and then we kind of kept buying assets. So we were always in acquisition mode. At the later stage of my career, that also involved taking a competitor out of a market because we combined assets with Cable and Wireless and Columbus. The Liberty transaction didn't really change that. However, it was always a consideration that we would have to deal with and address regulatory concerns through that process. So as such, we would have faced, certainly in the latter part of my career, more, I wouldn't say conflict, but more concerns on both sides of the table, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, where we were taking a competitor out of the region, and we were, in effect, for a period of time, creating a sort of monopolistic situation. And so trying to address those concerns and at the same time dealing with a very aggressive competitor on the other side from a different product set that had their own agenda, as we did. And that created complications for both the regulator to to determine what were the facts, what were the concerns, what were the competitive impacts. And so the impediment really from us was going forward, because there was so much uncertainty in terms of price regulation. Net neutrality at that time was obviously a very common policy instrument being developed, that it sort of made us look at those business cases in countries which were a little bit more uncertain and direct capital accordingly. So that's probably my best examples, but again, unique in the sense that the competitive landscape was being vastly changed, and we certainly understood that.
Okay, well, one of the things that we've done in regulation over a century now, well over a century, is tried to establish regulatory agencies as being independent of the operator, not controlled by the operator, and independent of politics. So always answering to the political laws, et cetera, but not being swayed by the day-to-day winds.
Right.
And we've shown in our empirical research that matters, that you get more investment if indeed the regulator has that kind of independence. I was wondering, in your practical experiences, did that ever show up in any of your discussions? The degree of independence of the regulator. And let me describe just one more thing on that. So one way that we describe that in our instruction is that absent a regulator, you have the politics and the investment kind of being intertwined with each other, and that doesn't go well. And so we put between them this independent regulator so that politics can have all of its difficulties and investment can have its long-term planning horizon. But that puts the regulator in a very tough spot. So back to the question, did you see that making any difference in any of your discussions, independence of the regulator? And do you see that relationship with the regulator being changed by what's going on in the pandemic?
Personally, and I'm sure there's those on taking in the webinar today that wouldn't agree with this statement, but personally, I never saw the regulator as having much independence from the government body. I just didn't, and the reason that I didn't was I've probably been in as apart from being a regulatory manager, I've probably been in as many government and regulatory meetings in the last 30 years as most executives, considering again we always had a lot of assets, so there were always a lot of relationships, and often the language, the objectives were very similar from a government perspective and the regulatory agent, which I always felt was a vehicle to implement that. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I believe that there is a certain degree of arm's length relationship between the government and a regulator, but the fact is the government in most cases appoints the chief regulatory officer in a country. And I also believe why that's important to have a quasi independent relationship is because the social policy objectives of the government have to be achieved on a broad scale, and they had to be consistent. And in other words, if the regulatory agent is a vehicle to help implement those important growth objectives from a social policy perspective, then I believe some sort of obviously a relationship has to be formed. I believe obviously the most perfect situation is that ultimately those considerations are taken and an independent decision based on the best decision should be made. I've been never convinced that that again, that independence has been established. I believe, and you will see that as well. I'll just take it out to the FCC and the government's change, and the conservative government really is in power, I guess. and the FCC's face looks a little different, and their approach to net neutrality is totally different than the Obama administration. So I think that kind of proves that I'm not quite sure how much independence there is, and I think that needs to be stated up front. What will change coming out of COVID-19, I believe, is nothing that will see that independence grow, and perhaps it shouldn't grow, because I believe the government, if we look at it as a trifecta in terms of the government, the regulator, and the industry, the telecom industry, they really should work together for common objectives as they can find and determine, and the most priority investments for the country and for what makes sense from a business perspective. So I believe they should always work together, each with its own role to play. But I really believe the regulators should concentrate on competitive forces in the various jurisdictions to make sure that there's nothing undesirable in terms of business practices, fair business practices from labor down to commercial policy. And really, at the end of the day, get out of the way then. Once that decision has been made as to what the objectives are among a broader group of stakeholders, then get out of the way and let it get done, and hold those accountable based on those shared objectives.
All right, well, thank you. So one of the things that you talked about in there is the regulator standing back, in a sense, allow the operator to make its business decisions, but then holding the operator accountable for those decisions, those outcomes. Thinking in your time as an executive, how would you like that accountability to have worked? How would you like to have been held accountable? Most of us probably would not, but understanding that's a good thing. How would you like for that to have worked?
Well, and again, I've been gone from Canada a long time, but there was an independent body created in Canada. I'm not quite sure in the United States whether it exists or not, but there was an independent body created of various stakeholders to ensure, I guess, some of the prime objectives and performance requirements of telco operators were met. And there was a consumer involved stakeholder group, it was regulatory, it was the various operators, and they were a self-accountable group. They held themselves accountable because I think at the time the industry saw itself as being in risk of more regulation, and through that I guess risk profile, they felt that we need to focus on ensuring that our business stands up to what we're telling the various stakeholders, government, regulators, consumer groups, customers. And so we need to self-regulate. I'm not quite sure how successful that was in the long term, but it existed for a long period of time. But I've never lost sight on that, and my last it never took root, but it was a concept we discussed, I know, with the regulator in Trinidad and Tobago when I worked there, and in other countries as well, to really form a broader stakeholder group that would have some sort of it's difficult to hold people's feet to the fire or firms accountable per se from a legal perspective. But that being said, oversight with independent ombudsman style stakeholder groups, and putting in place, which they do exist, by the way, certain SLAs between the regulator for performance of the operators is absolutely critical. We used to have right down to the basic how fast we would have to answer the phone, how many phone calls we would take. I mean, it gets down to the I guess the mice level in terms of some of those rules and regulations. But accountability actually does mean more when you get down to the root of a business, because policies and objectives followed and tied in with business plans are always laudable if done the right way, with long-term objectives in terms of nation building. When you get down to the performance of that and sort of the accountability, it really comes down to the front lines and also the policies and procedures in the middle of an organization that help you achieve that. So consultation by a broader group, putting in place certain service level agreements, as we would call them, to ensure accountability, and really, publicizing those and ensuring that the regulator can have some teeth behind as well, keeping those regulatory vices, I guess, available to them.
All right, thank you. I'm going to have one more question, and then we'll start trying to take some questions via the chat in the sidebar. So people, if you have questions, please type them there, and I will moderate that discussion for about 15 minutes before I turn things over to Samantha to moderate things from there. But I've got one more question, then I'll look to the audience for some. So you mentioned these service level agreements that sometimes you would have with the regulatory authorities. Could you describe what any of those were like? Because that's a question that comes up a lot, not necessarily in these webinars, but in our live trainings. A lot of people ask about those. I was wondering what they look like.
Well, one is that I will tell you that we really did strive to reach them and to meet them, either in Canada or even in Trinidad and Tobago, when we did get those established through the Telecom Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. We really held our managers accountable in terms of their performance, and most of it was tied to front lines. It wasn't tied to pricing, because in some countries, not all, you'd had to get pricing approvals anyway and justifications, and whether that was tied to prices, your internal cost structure increasing, content costs were always increasing. So it was a process in a lot of countries that we would have to go through. The service level agreements were really the performance of your company in terms of serving your customers to the best of your ability. And so we would collect the data. We would monitor our performance. We would submit reports to that organization, whether it was the independent organization in Canada or the regulatory body in some of the countries. But it really was a customer-facing objective, and that is, how do we serve those people who are giving us money every month? And so it was, as I indicated, there was also so besides the call center and because if you think of an operator's organization, the most difficult job, the most stressful job, and the most, I guess, the areas where telcos often fall down, apart from pricing, is on the call center. The call center, and if you think about spikes in traffic and to build your business around sort of those instances was always difficult. But so our focus was on the call center, making sure the schedules are fine. We would look at trends in terms of traffic and make sure that we were manned up, I guess, as it were. But also we would have to install, on average, we would have to install new service within a certain number of days. We would have to respond to an outage within a certain amount of hours. We would have to respond to service calls, general calls, within a certain amount of days. And so all that it was actually quite useful, because as a service provider, we always wanted to perform better than we were. We always knew we had a lot of Achilles heels. We didn't have enough ankles. We had a lot of Achilles heels. And one of them was being more customer focused and responsive. So I think, Mark, really, those kinds of operational SLAs are very, very critical. And they're not so much different if you think about it from a commercial service, a B2B perspective, where you have a suite of services and you're providing, whether it's infrastructure or cloud-based services, and you have service level agreements. And if you deviate or you fall short of those, you pay a fine. Certainly the fees that you're collecting, the monetary exchange, even over a period of time, changes because you haven't lived up to your part of the agreement. And I think that's always healthy.
Okay, well, thank you. If there's anyone who has questions, please put them in the chat. We'll convey them. In the meantime, I will have some more questions myself, but I'm now eating into the audience's time. So folks, please feel free to jump right in. Let's go back to those SLAs if we could for a moment, John. So we're seeing a lot of changes in services and how customers are using them during the pandemic. Do you foresee large changes in what those service level agreements will be between operators and regulators?
Absolutely. And I think those are the kinds of initiatives or oversight that a regulatory agency should empower itself with if it hasn't in the past. Because that's the uniqueness of the broader region, is that there are various regulators, so there's no real consistency outside of some collective bodies like the Eastern Caribbean with Hectel. And so I think, considering the importance of the infrastructure, which everybody's probably beat to death over the last 2 months, but the reality is something needs to change coming out of this. A lot of things need to change because society has changed, our expectations have changed, the importance of critical assets have changed. But also, I think the expectation that perhaps we can use this infrastructure, this connectivity, for what it's been initially built for, and that is for nation building and for economic growth and vitality. And so a part of that is to hold the stakeholders responsible for the invested capital and the performance of that invested capital. Now, at the same time, regulatory agencies can't overburden the operators or it defeats the purpose. Thus, it goes to I guess, my preference for more of a consultative approach going forward with all stakeholders to determine and to align priority investments, underserved areas, ubiquitous connectivity where possible, and a plan to achieve that. And at the same time, reach out to governments, because up to now, Mark, it hasn't worked is because there's only so much capital. And what's going to make it more difficult in post-COVID is credit facilities are going to be constrained. Companies will have difficulty, just sort of taking care of their own in-house activities. Most of those operators we speak to are heavy levered, and so they're cutting back operational costs. They are not paying dividends, as I indicated a couple of weeks ago. They're closing down certain activities. They're reducing their CapEx spend. So how do you do that? Well, one is you have to have a long-term vision. Others, and at the same time, you have to ensure government and regulators have to really join in terms of, can we contribute more than just taxation, policy, and regulatory oversight? What can we do to really help facilitate that growth?
Okay. We have a question from David Cox, whom I think you know. I think he's trying to put you on the spot here. So he says, if you're advising governments today, how would you advise them to get operators to connect customers who aren't currently connected, or to just expand the networks where customers are unserved? Is this a carrot and stick, a carrot approach, stick approach, something in between? What would be your advice to governments?
Thanks, David. I think should have fired him a long time ago, Mark. I think it's a carrot and a carrot. I don't think it's a carrot and a stick. I think a carrot and a carrot works best in terms of either those incentives that sort of are attractive to operators to build out networks where the business plans don't hold up, and the attractiveness of that is not holding a hammer over a head to force a build out. We all understand the importance of what we're addressing, and that is ubiquitous connectivity and lifeline services and in future economic growth. But how do you do that? And that's when you do bring in, obviously, tax incentives, more of a private sector or public sector investment strategy, understanding at the same time that I don't know of any country in the Caribbean or Latin America that's extremely rich. And so it's always a priority. If I look at a company's capital plan for the year, it's going through, as I discussed, it's a battle for internal resources and business cases, and you never get to accomplish what everybody wants to accomplish. Take that to a broader scale as in terms of a government, and you look at sort of the financial health of governments and their priorities and health and education and infrastructure they don't have besides other extended services, then we understand that there's not exactly a great pot of money to invest in any initiative. But that being said, critical decisions need to be made. Financial decisions need to be made, and companies need to look at this as well. It can't be a quarterly shareholder decision. It has to be a long-term investment strategy aligned with various stakeholders, and government needs to look at that and find opportunities to invest capital where they think it'll work. It's difficult to compare a South Korean example because they're not exactly, a basket case in terms of financial stability. But at the same time, I think the world does look at them in terms of what they've done and been able to do in terms of infrastructure and infrastructure sharing and connectivity and robustness. And again, while I don't have it in front of me, the old stats of, every dollar investment in telecom infrastructure and connectivity improves GDP, I think we all understand that. So finding a way to answer those difficult decisions, sometimes they're political for that stakeholder, sometimes they're from an internal stakeholder perspective or external stakeholder perspective. For telco operators, it just needs to be aligned, and that's difficult, but it's certainly not unachievable.
Okay. So we have a fairly long question from Craig Nesty, and I'm not sure I can synthesize it. So Craig, I'm going to put you off until Samantha's running things, and they'll let you explain your question if you don't mind, because I'm just not sure I'd get it right. So before we move to that part of our program here, John, I have one more question for you. You've talked about operating in the Caribbean, that there's multiple regulators, multiple countries. And then there's the ECTEL provides a little bit of contrast to that because it's cooperation among some countries. Right. Do you think it'd be good for more countries to cooperate together to give greater uniformity across the Caribbean? Or do you see that diversity of objectives, that diversity of how things are done as a strength to be leveraged?
I know the Caribbean has struggled for forever and a day, just at the CARICOM level in terms of, and extend that to a single market economy, which has never really taken hold. And I can understand the challenges of that in the independent individual countries, and ensuring that still level of independence while being part of a broader group is not easy, and we see it playing out in Europe with Brexit, and so there's examples of this obviously, and so but at the same time, when you look at the regulatory challenges created by multiple jurisdictions, some as small as a country in Montserrat, which is a beautiful country. I visited a couple of times, but I think 5,000 people live in Montserrat with a separate regulatory body. And not that the small ones have anything or any less intellectual than the large ones, but again, it's for us as operators. When I left as a cable and wireless, we had assets in 25 countries, and Liberty Latin America probably 30 now, I guess. And so you can imagine the challenges internally of developing responses or being proactive in dealing with regulatory agencies when inconsistencies exist. And it's not that one is better than the other in all the case. It's just that you have to duplicate your efforts, 25 or 30 times over. And what does make it difficult is the fact that some policies are different in terms of, rate regulation or not, in terms of perhaps in Trinidad, which I thought was good, actually, the oversight on service level agreements, which I think should be broad across the region. So I'm not sure, although there are consultations between governments at various levels and the regulatory agencies for sure, I'm not quite sure how much standardization or agreement there are on best practices and how to at least get to that level where consistency is achieved across the region from a regulatory perspective. From an operator perspective, ourselves, Digicel, say AT&I, whoever else, even the independent operators within the country, I'm sure they would appreciate that and know that when you go from one country to the next, it's the same set of rules. That's what makes it complicated and difficult for us.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So Sam, I'm going to turn things over to you to moderate. I deferred Craig because I think he'd be better explaining his question than I would be, but turn things over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Jameson. So right now for this portion of our session, we're going to go ahead and open that up to our participants to share. So in order to do that, if you're looking at the Zoom toolbar at the bottom, if you're using a desktop or a laptop, you'll see the participant tab. In there, you'll just select the hand raising icon, and that will allow you to raise your hand. Once that happens, then I will unmute your audio, and then you're free to share your video if you'd like. If you're using a tablet or a phone, that participant tab will be at the top of your screen. So as Dr. Jameson mentioned, it looks like we did have something from Craig. So Craig, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your audio. Just let me know if you can hear us.
Yes, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, we can. Thank you so much. So feel free to share your video if you'd like. And if not, then you're free to go ahead.
Okay. Basically, there's a situation in small island developing states that have been impacted by Hurricane Maria. Prior to the effect of the hurricane, a new licensee would have an obligation to roll out island-wide. What we see in post-Hurricane Maria is the service providers are basically cherry-picking areas where they deem to be profitable and not attending to certain areas. Now, what that has resulted in is creating a local digital divide. And as such, the poorest people in the community are paying the most for internet access because they're using metered internet on their mobile phones. Mm. And I'm wondering what sort of mechanisms should the regulators or the policymakers put in place to ensure that we don't create this local digital divide and ensure that the whole island has access to the internet at fair prices, especially during a pandemic situations where people are forced to stay at home.
That's a very good question, Craig, and I empathize. I will tell you, and I've been in the room post-hurricane, during hurricane, during those periods where decisions had to be made on rebuilding countries. And I will tell you at the outset that the process is that we look at new technologies to try to invest smarter, invest with a more robust network, both from a maintenance perspective as well as from a customer perspective. And that is, what can that network do for the customers? And I'm speaking as an individual. I'm not speaking as a former CEO even, or whatever role I used to have. I personally believe there's a responsibility for the operators to rebuild what was not there anymore. And what happens is that it is that old scenario of a limited amount of capital that has to be deployed. And where do we make that, and how do you make those decisions based on the operator's limited resources? Because again, as I keep stressing, an operator also has limited resources. That being said, I've also been around long enough to know that priorities can be determined objectively or subjectively, and understanding how we can help rebuild nations is just as important as building extensions in countries or upgrading networks where the business case holds up. I think the regulator needs to be more aggressive on that respect. And if there was a simple solution of replacing one kind of network connectivity with the other and providing that same level of service with the same pricing capability, then it would be a moot point in the short term. The long term is that I'm a firm believer wireless is extremely important, but I also believe a fixed line is also important. And I think the fact is a lot of the operators have both, which makes them in a very strong position. But I know, for instance, because I actually helped the regulator, believe it or not, help create some of the when it was becoming unregulated in Trinidad, because as a company in Canada, we tried to enter the Caribbean for about 10 to 12 years before we were successful. But at that time of developing the telecom policy, I was, while I didn't develop the policy or write the regulatory, documents. I was also very much consulted as to their expectation as to how much I would build out, upgrade every year, and I had to meet certain milestones. And I think that's the challenge again of inconsistency as well across the Caribbean, because I'm not quite sure all those regulatory requirements exist. So first and foremost, you have to create, from a regulatory perspective, you have to create the environment and the process for investment, absolutely. But you also have to create the documentation, the guidelines, so that certain financial and investment criteria are met and that they're monitored. And if they're not monitored, then they have to be, again, held accountable. I'm a firm believer in making promises to build businesses, but at the same time, understanding that I'm going to be held accountable for not achieving those objectives that were set on a commercial basis as well as from, a social basis. So it's a long-winded way to say this, Craig, but I believe that it's the regulator's responsibility to hold those operators responsible to rebuild networks better than they were before, obviously, but also to ensure that those, because that's exactly what happens. Though the poorest get poorer is the way I always say it, because they're always left behind in some respects. And I think that needs to be a priority. And if it's not clear in today's world, it'll never be clear.
Could I ask you a follow-up on that, John? And Craig, if you have follow-up as well, just raise your hand and Samantha will get you plugged in. So you've talked about a lot the kind of a multi-stakeholder discussion about what the service level agreements, et cetera. I think what you teed up there in your answer to Craig was that as you're building back from a hurricane disaster, we're moving into hurricane season here pretty quickly, or just post-pandemic, how do we connect people that haven't been connected before? How would you launch that multi-stakeholder discussion so that people were able to air, here's the values we have and the things that we're struggling with, and the operator can air, here's the financial realities, how fast things can work because we only have so many people, so many supplies, all those kind of harsh realities get out on the table and are dealt with fairly. How would you launch that discussion, and how would you manage it as well?
Well, not to put with my old friend David Cox on the line here, but the reality is I've always felt, and David does as well, I've been involved in Canto myself while I was working, and David has taken a very strong leadership approach. I'm very impressed because I think it's probably the best the organization's been run the last, since I've been in the region. As an example, I always go back to the Caribbean because that's most of my experience, but I can certainly speak to Latin America as well. It has to be led by someone. It has to be somewhat of an open tent starting point, but it has to be led by those stakeholders who feel they have the most to win or to lose. And that is, the operators, that's the regulators, that's the government. And you build from that, and you build a broader base of sort of consultation with various consumer groups and suppliers. And listen, there are a lot of very, very experienced suppliers and operators as well outside the region that can certainly lend a hand. Some very smart consultants that, again, as I said a couple weeks ago, well, I'm not a real big fan of consultants per se, just as a consultant. There are those who add a lot of value. And I think that what has to happen first, Mark, is that the stakeholders have to understand, or they have to reflect on how important the opportunity they find themselves in right now. This is the perfect time based on what our world is going through. And we're entering hurricane season, and we cross our fingers that we get through unscathed again. But at the same time, every year in our part of the world, there's a likely crisis, humanitarian crisis. And now we have that coupled with a huge financial crisis. And so you can't, and even the operators that typically don't tend to play well together need to sort of put aside some of those differences and get together and really build a long-term strategy. I'll say it out loud, is, Digicel filed for bankruptcy, which is probably not a big surprise. They will kind of figure it out with their bondholders, their lenders, and come back again, hopefully stronger. And Cable and Wireless, I know from my own experience there, and they're publicly traded companies, so no big surprises. What I will say is they're certainly more healthy than Digicel, but listen, they are a company that's built initially in the 19th century, and so rebuilding those companies and in those countries, because they've been at it forever, will take time. So their vision has always been a long vision in terms of having to, build infrastructure. But as a publicly traded company, of course, it's always the, what's the results this quarter and what's the results this year. So as a publicly traded company, they're also under some additional pressures that a Digicel wouldn't have, despite the difference in the balance sheet. So again, I'm not a person who has puts on rose-colored glasses in the morning and think that everything's going to work out well if we all talk. But I do believe that a sense of mutual respect and understanding the long-term objectives of each stakeholder is a good place to start. And then finding ways to do that with maybe some global bodies, either from a financial or consultative perspective, can really help that. And I think that's what really needs. I think it comes down to, we need some really good leadership across this region from all the stakeholders.
If I could just add some things to that, I agree wholeheartedly that someone really needs to own it. And that this person says, I'm going to make sure this happens. And whether that is someone from the industry, someone from regulator, or someone from government. In certain cases, that doesn't make a difference. It might in particular countries. There are three things that I've experienced that people might consider as elements of that multi-stakeholder process. One was something I've mentioned here before in our webinars. Julia Johnson was a regulator here in Florida. And when she became chairman of the Florida Public Service Commission, there was a history of some antagonism between the utilities and the regulator. She just launched an annual meeting, about 1 day, half day, which would be the CEOs of the utilities, some leading politicians, token academic, I was the token academic, and the regulator as well, all talking about what should Florida have in the future. So took that future view, let's all talk about what our vision is, what this will look like. And that dealt with a lot of very immediate issues. It just got people past where they were fighting in the moment, and that helped quite a bit. We also, just as PERC a few times in the state of Florida, ran what we called scenario planning, which was to take a future state that to get a group of regulators, industry, other people together, say, let's describe what the future should look like. And much like what Julie was doing, except people had to agree on what it should look like. And then we said, all right, now let's look back, and what role did each of you play to get us to that future state? That helped them quite a bit as well. And then my colleague here, Araceli Castaneda, our Director of Leadership Studies in companies, has helped them look ahead. What's the future company look like that we all are very proud to be part of, and it's doing great things for our country, a kind of a servant leadership model. And then had them talk about what are the steps that got you to that future state? Looking back, what actually got you there? And that, again, really helped with the planning. So just some tools and instruments to kind of help facilitate the discussion and free people's minds a little bit to consider possibilities.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as well, Mark, when we think of stakeholders and we think of the importance of what this infrastructure and connectivity and all the services means to a country, if you peel back the layers, then you know that there's an opportunity through broader consultation to bring in educators and entrepreneurs. There's a burgeoning amount, growth of digital startups in all over the planet, and yet some are constrained by their geographic location. The opportunity to sort of develop I keep going back to a nation plan, but that's really what it is. You don't have to be a politician to want to contribute to a nation plan. A nation plan exists for every citizen and every stakeholder, and having the opportunity to contribute to that and build out plans as to your point, scenario planning, and also environments that you want to be created in long term. And you're not inventing the wheel, you're not even reinventing the wheel. You are looking for also best cases that exist in developed countries, and developed countries also come in layers of sophistication, and look at opportunities to really make a difference. And I'll just point to one example of an activity going on in St. Lucia with the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, and their desire to rebrand, rebuild their community college, and with a focus on digital education, a digital learning academy creation. And really but their view is interesting, because their view is, if we build an attractive and internationally accredited university environment. It'll impact, obviously, their foreign students that want to come to study there, which will also impact tourism, because students normally have parents and they have friends and they have sisters and brothers. And so what they're looking at from an ecosystem perspective is our investment and sort of repositioning of our campus and our online programs can really help transform and grow the broader economic base of St. Lucia, and the government loves it. So, and so they're in the early stages of that, but you can see them, but it does depend on connectivity and does depend on creating those digital assets and that strategy and transformation that's required in many of these institutions. And they're a microcosm of their country and of the region, but those opportunities do exist.
Okay, well, thank you so much, John. Samantha, does anyone have their hands up?
No, it doesn't look like we have any hands raised just yet. Our audience is shy today.
All right, well, I have a follow-up question then, John. Just continuing on that theme of people sitting around the table trying to work out what the future should look like, what's that path to get there, how are all the different stakeholders held accountable for their role in that. How do you reconcile that with a competitive marketplace, which is one of our primary instruments for driving telecommunications into the future?
I think that's a very good question, and I also believe that despite what may appear to be limited number of competitors, which will probably change, because I think a competitor will look a little different in 5 years or 10 years than it looks today, I guess, in terms of what we view as competitors. It's no secret that there's some animosity in this region in particular between regulators and operators. But then actually, if you go another step further, there's probably a little animosity between particular regulators and one competitor and particular regulator and another competitor. It depends on the countries. That's been my experience. And largely because competitors have different objectives based on their profile. Not all companies look exactly the same, so their interests in regulatory policy may be a little bit different. They may see certain risks that would give another competitor a leg up if a certain policy is enacted. But at the same time, I'm confident that one is that the regulatory environment needs to be a level playing field. So where are those discrepancies? You start from that perspective. Is it just a perceived indiscrepancy? Is there scenarios where one particular operator, could be spectrum management, that is in a better position based on what they've been awarded than another competitor? So I think, and again, that's the challenge of dealing with independent regulators from across the region. But at the same time, if you can at least start with the objective of identifying opportunities to ensure that we, as regulators, have created a balanced and competitive environment. And I'll put competitive away because that would indicate that perhaps individuals may think there's not competitive enough. Let's talk about the existing competitive environment. The operators, and there's not just the two main ones, there are others, they had to feel comfortable, big or small, service, whatever they provide, is that they are under the same rules and regulations, and that they have been treated fairly since they have entered or grown in the region. So you start with that degree of fairness. And then, of course, the two stakeholders, and they've proven, by the way, I will have to go back to I guess the two large ones, because they have demonstrated their ability to work together through joint ventures. Columbus and Cable and Wireless, before the two merged, were actually in a joint venture on some of their subsea assets. As far as I understand, Digicel and Cable and Wireless are in a JV and some content procurement, because the costs, trying to manage the costs and sharing that asset throughout the region. So they've actually demonstrated it can be done when it's in their best interest. I guess that's what I would say, Mark. That's the ultimate perspective, is if it's in our best interest to get along while at the same time compete, then we'll be on board. It's just understanding that they can be treated fairly through that whole process. I think that's the most important thing for operators. And listen, operators, it comes down to individuals in companies like it does in government or in regulatory body. So having the confidence that those leaders can make the right decisions is also critical.
All right, thank you. So Sam, we have a question from David again. And if there are no others, maybe we can just wrap up after John answers David's question.
Sure. So, David, I just unmuted you. Can you hear us?
Yes, hi, I can hear you. Thanks,
Great. Thank you.
John, we're approaching the hurricane season, and I'm really keen to get your insight as a former CEO on a couple of things. First, what do you think are the things that governments and regulatory officials need to understand about the impacts of hurricanes on network operators? The immediate impacts, and then also, the long-term consequences for network operators, particularly, operators like, Cable Wireless or others that have companies in multiple countries that may have been affected by sometimes one hurricane or multiple hurricanes. Yeah. And then the corollary to that is, what would you now, having a bit of perspective, having gone through this, is there anything you would do differently as a CEO, looking back, in terms of your response or your company's response to a hurricane after it had passed?
Oh, good questions, David. The unfortunate scenarios always play out, as we know, and if it's not this year, it may be next year, and it could be 5 years from now, but at some point, one country or more will get impacted, some severely by Mother Nature. It's the unavoidable cost, another cost of, I guess, of operating and living in the Caribbean. What I would say is, and I think all companies have emergency response systems in place. Cable and Wireless did, I'm sure Digicel did. It goes down to the smaller companies and as well government agencies. It's well established because there's been a history of disaster in the region. So I believe, and I feel confident actually that the companies and the broader sort of public institutions are well prepared in many respects to deal with sort of the initial emergency that when it hits their country. I think what has to happen, and I probably sound like I'm repeating everything I'm saying today, but at the same time, why wait till after an emergency to sort of consult and to figure out how we solve an emergency? I mean, I think, again, good relationships go beyond ensuring that there's a policy to send people home, to have certain supplies on hand, to have backup power arranged, to have your generators full of gas. That's the mechanics in my mind of a hurricane response or a crisis response. Good policy, good business decisions, sort of a good strategy to develop to deal with what's going to happen afterwards, which is really the hard part. And I'm not diminishing the fact that lives could be lost, because that's the hardest part. But what I'm saying in terms of an operator's responsibility is to build back as fast as they possibly can a network, wireless or wireline, to provide the level of services that are required, which today we know are more critical. So understanding that up in front in terms of what those priorities should be, what is the government's perspective in terms of where, and the regulatory's perspective, where we should at least prioritize beyond the obvious. So having that sort of consultation up front and having a plan to sort of deal with the aftermath would help it a lot. I will tell you that what happens after a hurricane is the business cases are all redrawn again. So whether it's a small community in Dominica or a small city center, or if it's in St. George's in Grenada, the fact is every business case get redeveloped in terms of cost, build out time, revenue, and it's debated and discussed and prioritized. And I think that that has to happen because priorities need to be made based on capital restrictions. But again, priorities perhaps done with other stakeholders may be beneficial. So what would I do a little bit differently? I would probably enact those kinds of relationships a little bit more deeper through individuals like yourselves, and also community leaders that really carry the burden for companies like ourselves, as they are the frontline leaders. And at the same time, I think that we just need to do things faster. I remember sitting in rooms where business cases were developed and redrawn and redrafted and compared and contrasted, and in the meantime, and trying to determine the best technology to replace it with or to upgrade it with, and right from, you wouldn't believe it. And I think that just takes time. So having sort of having that work done up front, but also understanding, I guess, where you have to prioritize would kind of shorten that cycle. I think that's the only regret I have. I think I look, since I've been gone, I see Inga Schmitz as the CEO of Cable and Wireless and what she's led her team to do in terms of response, which is admirable. I know that the response from Jamaica to Trinidad, that all those countries, is the leaders, and not just the leaders, all the staff respond, and at their own peril sometimes. So I know that our human response has always been positive. I just don't think, and to go back to Craig's question and comment really, is, rebuild what's broken and prioritize connectivity, and don't forget the stakeholders that may not be providing the most ARPU to you, but are just as important as customers and as citizens. And I think that's a balance. But I will also tell you, if companies look to the long term and not a financial or a fiscal year, everybody tends to do okay. So I think that's the only thing I would push, David.
All right, thank you so much, John. So thank you for being here. Thank you for all the audience. We've greatly appreciated your participation.